In 1995, when I was already well into my 40s, I learned from a journalist that my late father, Boria Sax, had worked as a courier for the Soviet Union, passing secrets of the atom bomb obtained from a friend at the Manhattan Project. I had already had a tempestuous relationship with him, and my initial reaction was to feel almost sick. I didn't want to talk or think about it, and even gave away things that reminded me of him. But after a while, the distress gave way to relief, since it explained a lot of things that had previously seemed to be unfathomable mysteries, such as why we moved 6 times a year and why he talked in ways that seemed paranoid about being followed. All of a sudden, on reading his FBI files, my world had turned upside down. In terms of specific events, I learned that my childhood had been completely different from what I had thought. In terms of less tangible qualities, my intuitions were more than confirmed. There had been an amorphous, barely articulate terror running through the days of my childhood. I had not known how to talk about it, and it seemed a little self-indulgent or neurotic even to think about it. At times, I would universalize it, thinking it was the existential condition that the philosophers had spoken of. Often, I had dismissed it as a product of my overly excitable imagination. All of a sudden, I could see that it was not only very palpable, but not so difficult to talk about after all. The reality of my childhood turned into a fantasy, while the fantasy became terrifyingly real. The history was an official, objective record, while the reality was my memories blended, as they inevitably are, with fears and fantasies. The FBI files provided me with little information, but their appearance haunted me. There was nothing slick about them. The scribbled notes in the margins, the crossings out, the number of officials who initialed them, and the irregular pieces of tape covering the forbidden words. Henry Ford said, "History is mostly bunk." I'm not a fan of his, but I can see how this might seem right from his pragmatic, business-oriented view. And he did have a point. There are no lessons of history. History can never tell you what to do. It cannot even tell you what you should have done, since alternative scenarios are always very speculative. History may not be bunk, but it sure is messy. But history still seems important, at least to me. Maybe history is, or at least should be, just the total of the individual stories of those who have come before. But whether we realize it or not, these people still live on through us as we do through them. Without history, we cannot hope to understand ourselves, much less one another. For many rulers of the 18th century, history was a stage, and life was a perpetual performance, complete with costumes and stage settings. They managed a public image with at least as much deliberation and sophistication as any entertainer or politician does today. Many romantic artists, such as Byron, Goethe, and Whitman, not only managed public images, but also centered their writings on them, to a point where it is still very difficult or impossible to distinguish the human being from the persona or the poetry from the hype. And yet, the cumulative effect of all the posturing and image control can be to make history itself seem like a grand illusion. By carefully selecting a few events, arranging them by era and by movement, history confers on them an impression of impeccable order, significance, and even a stately dignity. But this is so different from the chaos that seems to envelop them as they unfold. And in this FBI file, what is really going on? Perhaps nothing much after all. But what could still be a matter of national security after more than half a century has passed? It is the failure and repression of memory, as much as the recording of it, which creates history. Essentially, a highly redacted version of experience. History is the black holes in the cosmos, the black lines in the manuscript, the way in which events are recorded in an FBI file, which becomes public decades later, if at all, can be a metaphor, and more than a metaphor, for the transformation of experience into history. Confidential informant of known reliability. These words come up constantly in my father's FBI file, usually next to a name that has been blocked out. These are secret, inscrutable presences which at times seem like the fairies of folklore. I cannot even guess at their identity, not even a single one, but there sure were a lot of them. Perhaps governments keep secrets, largely because these convey an aura of glamour and mystery, without which many affairs of state might be revealed in their human dimension, somewhere between banality and tragedy. We keep secrets, in other words, just to have secrets. They turn ordinary bureaucrats into James Bond, bumblers into evil geniuses or martyrs, and nervousness into paralyzing fear. But today, as we confront grave environmental, intellectual, and political crises, clarity of thought is not just a luxury. We need to lay aside false glamour and view the past in ways that do not make us less or more than human beings, except maybe in fun. Surely, after half a century has passed, neither the FBI nor any government agency anywhere in the world should need to stamp its documents with the word secret. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. This was wonderful, compressed, and we now have some time for questions. And I should say straight away that Professor Sax has left a leaflet here of this book that he's just talked about, and a couple of copies also. So those of you who are interested in this very dramatic story about which you will have some questions, please come here at the end of the lecture or at the end of the day. I'll keep this here. Okay, so the floor is open for discussion, please.
Oh, thank you very much. Any questions? Any thoughts? Well, if you don't have a question for me, I might have one for you. I've shared, some of my experiences learning about my father's activity that was, as I was growing up, completely unknown to me. As I began to share it, I found out that something of the sort had happened to a lot of people I know. I told my story, and then they told their stories, all through family history. A good friend of mine who travels a lot tells me that all her life, when she would go to the airport, they would never search her bags, and she would be immediately placed in the front of the line. She had no idea why. She discovered in her 30s that completely unknown to her, her father had been an agent for the CIA, and he'd put some sort of a secret code in her passport that said she shouldn't be searched and she should be moved in front. Now, I'd like to ask if anybody, has some stories they would like to share.
Well, maybe there is a question now. Yes, please.
Could you speak about your father's motivation, which I'm sure was touched upon by you, at least in putting the book together?
Well, that's a very good question. He grew up in a very isolated Russian Jewish family in a tiny community from a tiny village, speaking initially just Yiddish, and they all became communists, but even becoming communists, they retained so many of the customs of the village. They even had an arranged marriage. My aunt's husband was picked by her grandfather, and it wasn't somebody she wanted, but she went along with it because that's what she thought she was supposed to do. The result was, I think, that he had no sense of the inner logic of American society when he was growing up. It was just a whole big bunch of puzzles, and the communism there was, in my opinion, just something that served absolutely no purpose whatsoever except to give cohesion to a little community when traditional religion could no longer fulfill that purpose. But he grew up and with all this rhetoric that nobody around him took seriously, and he wanted to be Lenin, and he wrote in a little book, my goal is to create a world revolution. It must come soon. My sister is driving me crazy with her nagging about the housework and things like that. And, he was smart, but he was kind of lost, and along came this opportunity, and he grabbed at it. There's a lot about the motivation that I don't understand and will never understand. I mean, even with the context of a family, there are things that are pretty hard to pass along through generations. But I think for his generation, Marxism had an almost hypnotic hold on the imaginations of a lot of people that, particularly for young people today, is now just about impossible to imagine.
Are there any questions? Yes, please. You are getting some now.
Great.
My name is Brad from the United States. Kind of a question, kind of a comment. So, first, just to, clarify, are you proposing that nothing should ever be classified no matter what?
Things do have to be classified. I am proposing that after half a century or so has passed, after, 40, 50, 60, 70 years have passed, I don't see how anything could be a matter of national security, and I don't really see how there could be any danger in letting people know it. And I think that all of these tiny black lines, these empty spaces, not only limit our knowledge of history, but also greatly distort it, because they add a sort of false melodrama, and they stimulate people's imaginations, who then go crazy, imagining all kinds of counterplots and plots and weird things that never existed. And I think that, once a certain amount of time has passed, at least for historians, if we just let everything out, we'll be able to understand it not only better, but more in human dimensions.
I think you had another question.
I was just going to get to my comment portion, but that makes perfectly good sense as far as being open. I've just heard an argument from multiple other people that nothing should ever be classified, everything should be out in the open. But I have a bit of a military background, so people get this conception that we classify things to hide these super top secret James Bond stories, but that's not the case. It's really to hide capabilities. If people know how these capabilities work, then they are proven ineffective. People complain about the U.S.'s defense budget. A lot of that is because capabilities have been out there and proven them ineffective. You have to get now new technology. New technology is expensive. And so it's more so just hiding those capabilities. So I agree there should be an openness, especially well after the fact with what is going on. But those true capabilities, it can render any military ineffective if everyone knows how everything works.
Well, I agree with you. Again, we've got to be practical. As far as current things, there are reasons, good reasons. I don't have a problem with that. But again, I'm talking about history, and history not just as something that's past, but something that continues today and that we want to see and understand with the greatest possible clarity. I'm concerned about the mystification, not just so much just about our ignorance, because I mean, ignorance is no big deal. We're ignorant about a lot of things, but the mystification that goes on when there are a lot of secrets and everything starts to seem 10 times larger than life, than it ever could have been.
Well, thank you. Well, I think we really have to move on, but I would like to thank you first of all for this fascinating talk. But may I make one remark? You have, of course, I think in the last few days been overwhelmed with all sorts of approaches to the world. And I thought this was a very important talk, perhaps, because it showed also in terms of cultural diplomacy how important one's own socialization is and how fixed one often becomes in his own tradition and in his own upbringing. But to break out of this is, of course, and to relate and be open and be international is very difficult. And I would like to mention only one example. When I studied in Chapel Hill many years ago, this was a liberal island in an otherwise deeply segregationist South still. This was at the beginning of the civil rights movement. And there were some students who came from the deep South who had grown up in a very segregationist environment, and nevertheless they succeeded in breaking out of this. And I think Chapel Hill as a university actually helped them with this, because they could actually also engage and change at least this small community, because Chapel Hill at the time was the place where the sit-in movement started. Mm-hmm. And many of these students who had grown up in this very constrictive social environment actually went to Howard Johnson's and took a number of African American students with them and said, "We want to be served." And initially the people said, "Terribly sorry, we don't serve blacks in this community." And that was the 1960s still. And then, of course, they integrated very quickly, because the students and also the faculty at Chapel Hill refused to go to these restaurants. And it was that kind of pressure which actually made these local businessmen change their mind very quickly. But the courage of breaking out of this environment, I think, was really remarkable, and I really admired some of the people who came from this family background, like in many ways your father, and then of course broke out of it. So that's perhaps what I would like to add as a comment for your very interesting paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. My nephew, I think, is kind of all American, you know. I'm at a little bit of a remove, but it's taken us, I think, 4 generations, and I think that's about typical.
Yeah, yes.